Hey everyone, this is our Sunday Bible study for February 7th, 2021. We're continuing our study in the Foundations material from the Gospel Advocate. This quarter we have been looking at the book of Genesis, and we are currently ready for lesson number 10 in the classroom book. It is entitled Joseph and His Brothers. It is taken from Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 24. The author of the book begins by saying that members of a family should love one another. This is natural and proper. The Apostle John also encouraged Christians to love one another in 1 John 3:11. But he warned not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brothers righteous. Unlike Cain, we are to seek the best for both our physical and our spiritual families. Emphasizing the point, John added, we know that we have passed from death to life because we love the brethren. He who does not love his brother abides in death. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. 1 John 3 verses 14 and 15. Examples of brothers treating one another with spite are unfortunately more common in Genesis than examples of loving behavior. Cain murdered Abel, Genesis chapter 4 and verse 8. Ishmael mocked Isaac, chapter 21 and verse 9. Jacob took Esau's birthright and stole a special blessing intended for him in chapter 25 verses 29 through 34 and chapter 27 verses 18 and 19. And Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery and lied about his demise. Very little brotherly love is depicted. Thankfully, Joseph did not treat his brothers with hatred or contempt when given the opportunity. Not knowing Joseph was still alive, the brothers eventually made their way to Egypt to buy grain. You recall as we left off last week, one of the last verses that we looked at was the fact that there was grain in Egypt. The famine was severe throughout everywhere. It wasn't just in the land of Egypt, it was everywhere. But because of Joseph and because of God putting him in that position, there was grain to be found in Egypt. And so that kind of set up what we're going to be looking at through this lesson. Joseph was in charge of the famine relief program. And Joseph, he recognized his brothers and made inquiries of them. Many times people ask the question, Joseph recognized them. Why didn't they recognize Joseph? Well, you got to think about, first of all, you have Joseph, quite a few years has passed, and he was younger when they saw him. The younger you are, the more that you change as the years pass. And so his brothers would have had that going against him. Furthermore, he's been living in Egypt all this time. More than likely, he's dressed as an Egyptian. He has jewelry on as Egyptian. He's groomed as an Egyptian. So that's going to disguise him even more. And also, he spoke to them through an interpreter. If this was Joseph, well, then Joseph could have spoken Hebrew to them. But instead, he spoke to them through an interpreter. And so all that adds together. While he recognized his brothers didn't recognize him. Although he questioned their intentions, verse 14 of chapter 42, he provided them with grain, money, and provisions for the journey, verse 25. When the brothers returned a second time with Benjamin in the group, Joseph hosted a feast at his house. He did not yet reveal his identity. Instead, he sent them away with the grain they sought, but framed Benjamin by placing his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. If you read the account, he's going to send them on their way, but he has one of his servants take his special silver cup and put it in Benjamin's sack. And so after they had gone a little piece, he sent soldiers after them and said, why have you stolen from our master? And they said, hey, whoever's sack the cup is found, because they didn't think anyone had stolen it. They said, that man will surely die. Well, it was found in Benjamin's sack. This was done to test his brothers. Instead of abandoning Benjamin, Judah, who years earlier suggested the brothers sell Joseph into slavery, offered to take Benjamin's place and be punished in his stead. Now think about that. If you're Joseph, you're sitting there. Here's the one that suggested you be sold into slavery. But now we see a change in him. He's willing to be punished, be put to death instead of Benjamin. Summarizing the event, Gangle and Brammer wrote, Joseph had tested his brothers by framing Benjamin and allowing his other brothers to go free if they so chose. How the other brothers reacted is not stated, but the fact that all the brothers returned seems to indicate that they were united in their commitment to their father and to Benjamin. Judah's intervention on their behalf showed the great love that he had for his father and the loyalty he had to Benjamin. It also demonstrated that the brothers were not willing to repeat the act they had committed against Joseph many years before. They were not perfect, but they were showing signs of repentance and change. Joseph had seen enough. And that brings us to chapter 45 now. Beginning in verse 1, we're going to see here Joseph beginning to reveal himself to his brothers. The author of the book says Judah's intercession on Benjamin's behalf was quite telling. He asked Joseph, Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father? Much had changed in the behavior of his brothers in the 2 decades since Joseph had been sold into slavery. In verse 1, we read, Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, Make everyone go out from me. The emotions at this point for Joseph, they're just too much. Everything that's taking place and the fact that his brothers don't even know that it's him, it's just become too much. And so he wants everyone, not his brothers, but everyone to go out from him. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. That's why I'm saying the brothers stayed. And when it says he made everyone go out from him, it's talking about all the servants and the other Egyptians that were there with him. And so now it's just him and his brothers. The author of our book says Kissling wrote, Certainly this was a personal matter for Joseph, and he wanted privacy. But there is undoubtedly more to it. It could be that Joseph did not know what the reaction of his brothers would be. It could also be that they needed privacy to plan for the future of the family. The narrator uses Joseph's name and refers to his siblings as his brothers, emphasizing that what was about to take place was the beginning of the process of familial reconciliation. I mean, you think about it, there's got to be a rift here. Well, while Joseph is more than willing to forgive, and he doesn't view what they did, he views it as God putting him where he needed to be. But the brothers had to have felt it. I mean, they had sold this guy into slavery. And so a process has to take place to mend that rift that has been created. In verse 2 it says, And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Now, whether or not this means they heard the weeping was so loud that it carried all the way to Pharaoh's house, I don't know where Joseph lived in proximity to Pharaoh or to the palace or any of those things. But regardless, we have here Joseph, the weeping that was done. If they didn't hear it physically, they heard about it through word of mouth. The word spread about what was going on. Verse 3, Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? Just take a moment to think about this. They have no idea that this is Joseph. They haven't recognized him. They don't know that this is their brother. And then just out of nowhere, he says, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? Well, what a shock this must have been. And we see that it was a shock. But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed and in his presence. The author says, as Curavella noted, the impact of Joseph speaking to them in their own tongue and revealing himself as their long-lost and presumed dead brother is so powerful The brothers are rendered speechless and even terrified. After all they had been through at the hands of this anonymous Egyptian ruler, what would a powerful Joseph, whom they had once sold into slavery, do to them? They don't know what to think at this point. There's amazement, I'm sure, at the fact that here's Joseph. I mean, they sold him in slavery. They probably figured by this point he had died, because the life of a slave was not an easy life. And many times things would take place that would lead to death. Furthermore, they recognize the position that Joseph now has and the power that he wields. All Joseph has to say at this point is, I want them all put to death except for Benjamin, and they're done. And so there's amazement, there's wonder, and there's a lot of fear going on here with these individuals. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." That must have been terrifying to hear him say. Now, obviously, his statement's not done. And we'll notice he's going to add a little bit more onto that here in just a moment. But just to hear him saying, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. I'm the one you sold into slavery. And now I'm the one sitting here with your fate in my hands." No doubt that's what the brothers heard. That's not what Joseph is getting at. In an attempt to ease their fears, Joseph credited God with being the one who brought them to him. He says in verse 5, "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." On page 110 in the book, the author says, although the brothers intended to do Joseph harm, God had other plans. Joseph was providentially placed in a position to save his family. And we talked about that last week, that as you watch the life of Joseph, there's a lot of ups and downs, but we see Joseph remaining faithful through all of it, and we see God remaining faithful to Joseph through all of it. Those ups and downs, the downs were because of things that people did, but the ups were because God was with him through it all. That brings us now to our second section, where Joseph has a plan for his family. The author says, rather than harboring ill will toward his brothers, Joseph recognized his placement in Egypt as part of God's plan. At the time of their reunion, the famine had lasted 2 years, but Joseph knew it would last 5 more years. Thus he declared, "And God sent me before you." This is verse 6. The famine was going to last for 5 more years. He says, "For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting." Verse 7, "And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." The author of the book says, had Joseph not been in Egypt, his family would have been in jeopardy of starvation. Because he was there, hope existed. This was all by God's design. Selhammer wrote, Joseph's words pull back the narrative veil and allowed the reader to see what has been going on behind the scenes. It was not the brothers who sent Joseph to Egypt. Rather, it was God. And God had a purpose for it all. That doesn't mean that God made them sell him into slavery. That's not what's being stated here. God doesn't take away our free will. We have the free will to choose. Judah could have chosen not to make that suggestion. They as a group could have chosen not to sell him into slavery, not to trick Jacob into thinking that he had died. But they did that, and God still was able to use that to bring about his end result. And so by saying that it was God who did it, Joseph's acknowledging the fact that God used that action, although it was not right, he was able to still use it to accomplish his ultimate will. Joseph, who could discern the divine plan in the dreams of Pharaoh, also knew the divine plan in the affairs of his brothers. Through it all, he saw God's plan to accomplish a great deliverance. Joseph sees the hand of God at work in all of this, and he lets his brothers know this is God's way of making sure that we're going to be all right. In verse 9, he says, "Hurry and go up to my father, and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry." Can you imagine what Jacob's going to think? Now, I'm sure here we have the brothers who are actually seeing him, and their amazement at this. No doubt Jacob, who's not going to be able to lay eyes on us yet, he's going to be amazed. And he probably has some questions. That's one thing the Bible doesn't go into, but I've often wondered. At some point, Jacob had to have some questions of the rest of the brothers, because they returned with a coat that was ripped to shreds and covered in blood. How is Joseph alive and well if that was the remnant of what was brought to him? Now, the Bible doesn't go into that, but it would be interesting to think about and to hear how that conversation would have went. And so Joseph is giving the instructions: go to Jacob, tell him that this is what I say, that I've been made Lord of all Egypt, and come down to me, do not tarry. Verse 10, you shall dwell in the land of Goshen. That's going to be interesting, the way that they are separated from the Egyptians. That's going to come into play during the plagues in the book of Exodus. "And you shall be near to me, you and your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine." And so he's sending his brothers. He wants them to go back, tell Jacob, get all your stuff, get everybody together, and come to where I'm at so that I can provide for you. On page 111, the author says, knowing the famine would get worse before it got better. Remember, they're only 2 years in. They're not even halfway through this thing yet. Joseph intended to care for his entire family in Egypt. According to Steinman, his message to Jacob is also not to delay. In stating that God had made him Lord of all Egypt, Joseph may have been seeking to allay any fears that Jacob may have of abandoning the land of God's promise. Jacob, obviously, Canaan was the place where God had promised that's where they would dwell. And so Joseph's saying, hey, God's put me in this position in order to make sure that you're safe, so come to where I'm at. There are other items, it says in his invitation, that Joseph used to induce Jacob to move to Egypt. First, as a positive inducement, Joseph offered Jacob a place in the land of Goshen. Goshen is said to be near Joseph, but also able to accommodate Jacob's children and grandchildren. Second, as an added incentive, Joseph mentioned the negative impact of the famine, that there would be 5 more years of famine, and in Canaan, you, your household, and everything you have will become destitute. And so he's wanting Jacob to come to him, and so there's a positive incentive, a negative incentive. Verse 12, and behold, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. Here we have a reference probably to, look at me and look at Benjamin. You see the resemblance. And also, it's my mouth that speaks. I'm an Egyptian speaking Hebrew to you. And also, if you remember, then you know the sound of my voice. At the age that he was when he was sold into slavery, while a lot of physical features might have changed, his voice should have already changed by then, and so his voice would still be pretty well the same. Verse 13, so you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and all that you have seen, and you shall hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. depending on how you figure up the years and stuff, it's hard to determine whether or not Joseph knew about Benjamin, or whether when the brothers came, that was a revelation to him that he had a brother that was, the other brothers are half brothers because they had different mothers, but Benjamin and him had the same mother. Verse 15, moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. Once again, we don't have a whole lot of information given to us about what that conversation sounded like, but I'm sure it would have been interesting to hear. It's not necessary for the narrative of the account, but it definitely would have been interesting to hear what things would have been discussed. Verse 16, now the report of it was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brothers have come. So it pleased Pharaoh and his servants well. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this. Load your animals and depart, go to the land of Canaan. Bring your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat of the fat of the land. Now you are commanded to do this. Take carts out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and your wives. Bring your father and come. And do not be concerned about your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Here we have Pharaoh showing his blessing upon this, and he's providing things that they may need to make this easier. The author of the book says, no expense would be spared. Joseph's family would be treated like royalty. Woods observed Pharaoh not only was happy to learn more about Joseph's background, which he discovered was quite honorable and prosperous, and to become acquainted with Joseph's family, but also the turn of events gave Pharaoh an opportunity to express the profound gratitude of his government for Joseph's vital service. This last he does by generously offering Joseph's family the best of the land of Egypt. In verses 21 through 24, we close out our account. Then the sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them carts according to the command of Pharaoh, and he gave them provisions for the journey. He gave to all of them, to each man, changes of garments. But to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments, and sent to his father these things: 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and food for his father for the journey. So he sent his brothers away and departed, and he said to them, see that you do not become troubled along the way. That brings us to a couple of applications that we want to notice as we close out. And the first application the author gives us, he says, rather than blaming his brothers for all they did to him, Joseph saw his situation as the result of God's work. This was easier to do from an Egyptian palace than it would have been in an Egyptian prison. Nevertheless, Joseph could look back over his life and see the hand of God at work. He was in a position to save his family, and he intended to do that very thing. Rather than dwelling upon the many ways we have been wronged in life, let us focus on the good we can accomplish where we are. I thought that was some great words there. Let's focus on the good that we can accomplish where we are. That brings us to the second application. Joseph's final charge to his brothers before they depart is significant. He did not want them to become troubled along the way. He did not want them to fight amongst themselves. As brothers and sisters in Christ, we should seek to avoid such fights as well. Paul warned the Galatians, but if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another. You know, as Christians, we're family. And as family, yes, sometimes we're not always going to agree. Sometimes we might get on each other's nerves a little bit. But at the end of the day, we're family. And we should conduct ourselves as such. That's the end of the lesson. That brings us to next week. Next week we'll be in lesson number 11, Jacob in Egypt. And taken from Genesis chapter 47, we're going to notice verses 1 through 12 and also verses 27 through 31. As we studied together, if you've heard some noise in the background, that has been our 2 cats, Cleo and Claudia. They woke up, I'm recording this at nighttime, and they had been napping, but they woke up, and when they wake up from a nap, they chase each other all over the place. They jump all over the place. Normally, I'll get some toys and play with them. Of course, I'm sitting over here recording, but if you've heard some noise in the background at times, that's who you're hearing. Those two cats going crazy. Once again, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for spending time out of your day so that we can study God's Word together. And I hope you'll join with us again next Sunday as we study another lesson from God's Word. Remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay holy, and I hope that you have a great day.